Welcome to History 112, Lecture 10, American Imperialism. As we discussed in a previous lecture, foreign affairs really take over American politics during McKinley's presidency. And remember, in 1896, he had defeated Bryan and presides over a period of relatively ineffective opposition. Labor unrest had been broken by the failure of strikes and lack of court support. Agrarian unrest had largely died with the failure of the populace. And by the second year of his presidency, we're in a war with Spain. Now, the election of 1800 is going to go ahead and bring McKinley back against Bryan with different vice presidents. And Bryan is really going to be talking about imperialism and, to a lesser extent, the gold standard. And that's ultimately going to continue like that for about a year until McKinley is assassinated and Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. Now, to understand how imperialism became central to American politics at this point, we have to back up a little and remember that the United States had expanded very little beyond its current borders in the Civil War. There had been a focus on consolidating all that antebellum continental expansion. It's only in the 1890s that the United States begins to look abroad for new markets and sources of raw materials, and as part of a reaction to social unrest in the 1890s, and an influence also of European imperialism as part of that, and a continuation of Manifest Destiny. Because we have to remember, at the beginning of the time period we're talking about in this course, America's great question, having settled the West, is now what? And by the 1890s, the answer to now what is increasingly imperialism. Now, Americans are going to increasingly find justification for imperialism in social Darwinism, which argued that weak nations would be dominated by strong ones and that was a law of nature. That was something that was right and normal and consistent with other American values. Now, the United States is also going to play a leading role in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere, and the region is going to serve as an area of the United States to undertake new ventures as it begins to expand out in the world. Now, the Republican Secretary of State James Blaine had sought to promote hemispheric cooperation through the 1899 Pan American Congress, and he created the weak Pan American Union, but delegates had ultimately failed to adopt Blaine's proposal for an inter American customs union and arbitration of local international disputes. Now, this is a logical extension of the Monroe Doctrine, and was really there to help build the U.S. economy, because what he wanted to do was increase cooperation between these nations, but also remove a lot of trade barriers that would have benefited the United States economy. Now, the other members of the Pan American Union, while they're interested in greater cooperation, did not feel this way, and so ultimately the Pan American Union doesn't produce the results that Republicans are hoping for at this point. And all throughout the 1890s, Latin America is very central to the American mind when we're thinking about foreign policy. And by 1895, the United States has to intervene and support Venezuela in a boundary dispute against Great Britain. Now, Britain isn't going to initially ignore American demands that the issue be subject to arbitration. And the Secretary of State at the point claimed that Britain was violating the Monroe Doctrine. And President Cleveland established an international commission to examine the issue and threatened war with Britain if the commission's findings were ignored. Ultimately, Britain is going to accept arbitration, so we see the first hints of the United States flexing its muscle, and it's really over things like guaranteeing the Monroe Doctrine in the beginning. One of the most important books of this time period is written by a man named Alfred Thayer Mahan, and he is a naval officer who argues that countries built with strong navies are able to control the oceans and were therefore going to be the most successful through dominance of trade. And he is going to urge American leaders to undertake the construction of the Panama Canal, to acquire defensive bases and acquire overseas possessions to build bases with, and also to massively expand the U.S. Navy. And out of Thayer Mahan's theories comes what we see here. If you look, during the 19th century, the second half, you're seeing the increasing acquisition of small little islands and bases all throughout the Pacific. Aside from Latin America, the other area where Americans were mainly interested in pursuing economic gains was the Pacific. And early through the 19th century, American missionaries and sugar planters had already built up an influence in Hawaii, and in 1887 the United States further expands on that by negotiating a treaty to open a naval base at Pearl Harbor. Now, the Hawaiian economy by this point had become dependent on the export of sugar to the United States, and suffers a severe shock when in 1890 the McKinley Tariff no longer allows Hawaiian sugar to enter duty-free. Before this, it had been exempt from those taxes and given Hawaiian sugar a significant advantage over Caribbean sugar, and taking away that advantage causes some real economic hardship in Hawaii. Now, that shock to the Hawaiian economy sets off a series of dominoes that ultimately leads to the sugar planters, who were mainly American, overthrowing the Hawaiian government and deposing and setting up their own regime. Now, that regime attempted to negotiate annexation of Hawaii into the United States, but the Democratic controlled Senate refused to support this because the Democrats are largely anti imperialist at this point, and the treaty is not passed until Republicans turn to power in 1898. One of the other acquisitions that was very important was Samoa, and in 1798 the United States had negotiated a treaty for Samoan leaders to obtain a naval station there. But by 1899, the United States, Great Britain, and Germany had all really expanded its interests, and also it happens the United States and Germany agreed to divide the island between them and compensate Britain with other territory elsewhere in the Pacific. Now, while the United States is flexing its muscle, acquiring bits and pieces and important things from a naval and strategic point of view in the Pacific, what really sets off the United States down an imperialist course is the Spanish-American War, and that grew out of conflicts in the 1890s between Spain and the colony in Cuba. Now, we should understand that from about 1868 on, Cubans had been undertaking revolts trying to obtain independence from Spain, and a big rebellion broke out again in the 1890s, and this is made all the worse by the loss of American sugar markets due to the Wilson-Gorman tariff, ultimately eliminating the preferential rate that Cuban sugar had been receiving. And that shock to the Cuban economy is also going to feed in to the chaos there. As events are unfolding in Cuba, American public opinion plays a very key role in what happens next, and one of the most significant factors is what's called yellow journalism. Now, the American press, led by people like Pulitzer and Hearst, are going to report on Spanish atrocities in Cuba and ignore the atrocities that existed on both sides. So they're painted as the Spanish committing atrocities against innocent Cubans, and they're not going to tell the other side of the story. Now, those reports, which are ultimately in some cases going to grow into printing things that never happened and a lot of stories that get made up and printed as if they were fact, all for sensationalist reasons and all to sell large numbers of newspapers, all of those reports, plus lobbying efforts by Cuban refugees in the United States, are going to cause the United States overwhelmingly to move its public opinion just towards supporting U.S. intervention in Cuba. But the president at the time, Cleveland, a Democrat who was anti-imperialist, is going to resist that call. However, McKinley comes back into office in 1897, and he is going to take a much stronger position about Cuba and demands that Spain make extensive reforms there. Now, this is going to turn into a demand for war, as a letter from Spanish ministers in Washington ended up being published in the newspapers. They were highly critical of McKinley and called him something of a coward. There's also the explosion of the U.S. battleship Maine in 1898. It was reported at the time that it was caused by a mine that had been intentionally destroyed by the Spanish, although later evidence suggested that it was an accident caused by an explosion in the engine room. That was neither here nor there at the time. The newspapers were reporting atrocities. They were reporting that the Spanish ministers called our leaders weak. They were reporting that the Spanish had blown up our battleship, and Americans adopted the slogan, "Remember the Maine," and Congress ultimately appropriates $50 million for military preparations. Last-minute negotiations with the Spanish fail, and Congress votes to declare war at the end of the month of April. Now, American forces very early on succeeded to move from Florida to Cuba in order to confront Cuban troops in Santiago Harbor. There was a series of battles there, most notably San Juan Hill, which makes the reputation of Teddy Roosevelt, who we'll talk about later. And American troops ultimately pushed their way into Santiago Harbor. The Spanish government has to decide to abandon the strategic port city, and the Spanish fleet is destroyed by U.S. ships as it tries to flee. The Cuban campaign was quite short, and fighting ended there in August. The Secretary of State, John Hay, dubbed it a splendid little war. But the American war effort was not without problems. While 460 Americans were killed as a result of casualties in battle, 5,200 died of disease. The war effort was highly inefficient, and there was marked racial conflict between black and white troops during this campaign. Now, the Spanish American War started over events close to the United States, but takes on global dimensions very early on orders from Teddy Roosevelt, who was at this point the Assistant Secretary of the Navy and not yet involved in the fighting in Cuba. This is just before he does that. He orders Admiral George Dewey to seize the Philippines, and this helps shift the war from a conflict meant to free Cuba to a war to strip Spain of its colonies, although no thought was given with what to do with those territories after the United States had obtained them. Now, by August 12th, Spain had agreed to an armistice, and that armistice, Spain agreed to recognize Cuban independence, it would cede Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States, and accepted the American occupation of Manila pending the outcome of fighting in the Philippines. So, in other words, they agreed to a ceasefire everywhere but in the Philippines, where fighting was still contested. The American occupation of Puerto Rico was one of the less controversial parts of this war. American troops that occupied the island during the Spanish-American War remained there until 1900, when the Foraker Act ended military rule and established a form of colonial government. By about 1917, the United States comes along and decides that the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States needed to be clarified, and Congress passes the Jones Act. This declares Puerto Rico to be a United States territory and makes all Puerto Ricans American citizens from that moment on. Now, the addition of Puerto Rico to the United States is a big boom to the island sugar industry, and because Puerto Rican sugar can now enter the United States duty free, and the Puerto Rican economy became based on large sugar plantations that tend to be owned by Americans operated by native Puerto Ricans, and there's a decline in other forms of food industry there. There's greater independence as a result for this island on international sugar prices. The Treaty of Paris is signed in December of 1898 and not just confirms the original armistice terms, but also added in the annexation of the Philippines, for which the United States paid Spain $20 million. Now, there were also a number of opponents of annexation at this time. The Anti-Imperialist League, which was a largely upper-class movement, is very important to that, and the Anti-Imperialists are going to make a variety of moral, racial, economic, and political arguments against the acquisition of this territory. But supporters of annexation are going to counter with an equal variety of arguments, and often enough, supporters of annexation are going to use Native Americans and what happened with that population as a precedent. The treaty is ratified in February 1899. Now, William Jennings Bryan, who we have noted from a number of presidential elections already, is also an anti-imperialist, but he is going to help gain passage of the treaty because he wants to make imperialism the central issue of a 1900 presidential election. This strategy is going to backfire, and McKinley is going to defeat him even more decisively than he had in 1896. Now, other territories like Hawaii, Alaska, Puerto Rico offered relatively few problems for the United States when it came to what to do with them and what annexation would be. The Philippines was controversial, and you had people arguing about whether or not we should take control of this, and you had disturbing arguments on both sides, with anti-imperialists being racist, whereas imperialists were comparing it to Native Americans and the things that had been done there, and saying as if it was a good thing. So overall, the Philippines becomes a very sort of dark debate. Most of the territory was no big deal, but Cuba is the other place that's problematic. And Cuba is going to be occupied till 1902 and help try to rebuild the Cuban infrastructure, and that rebuilding is going to lead the way for paving the American domination of the Cuban economy. So with that military presence and that rebuilding and that American economic penetration and only being 90 miles from the United States, Cuba's fate is going to be tied in much more with the United States than the Philippines will be. Now, in 1898, Congress does, however, pass the Teller Amendment that stated that the United States not annex Cuba, and that was part of a declaration of war. So all from the beginning, the outcome of Cuba could be anything except it becoming part of the United States. In 1901, they revisited the issue and passed the Platt Amendment, which forbids Cuba from making treaties with other nations and allows the United States to intervene to protect Cuban independence and allows the United States to maintain naval bases in Cuban territory. The United States also pressured Cuba into incorporating those terms into its constitution. And what that means is, while Cuba is going to be nominally independent, it is very clearly going to be tied in with the United States and the United States economy, and it's going to be essentially a colony of America. Now, like Puerto Rico and Hawaii, the Cuban economy is going to become even more dependent on exporting sugar to the United States, and that's going to really define Cuba's future for about the next 40 to 50 years. Now, the American occupation of a lot of these territories went relatively unopposed. In Cuba, for example, they understood that American occupation would end and Cuba would retain its independence. But in the Philippines, a full scale rebellion breaks out. And what had happened was the Philippines was in a state of rebellion against Spain to begin with, and the Filipino nationalists had not fought Spain just to bring in a different colonial power. So during the course of the Philippine Rebellion, more than 4,300 American troops and at least 50,000 Filipino soldiers were killed between 1898 and 1902. Now, at that point, the United States transfers control of the Philippines to a civilian governor, one William Howard Taft, who is an individual whose name we'll hear later. He becomes president and also Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And the Philippines becomes a place where a lot of people go to make their reputation. For example, an important military figure later on in World War I, Pershing, he really makes his reputation as a military officer to get things done by engaging in some tactics that were very, very ruthless at times in the Philippines to subdue local opposition. Now, as had been the case in Cuba, American occupation introduces major reforms on the island and is going to produce an almost complete economic dependence on the United States for the part of the Philippines. Now, the Philippines is going to receive its independence from the United States in July of 1946. Now, what is going to happen there is the Philippines is going to be revisited about a decade or two later, where increasingly the United States decides that the Philippines should be independent at some future point. A date for independence is going to be established, and that is going to be derailed by World War II and the Japanese occupation. So when World War II ends, the Philippines is given its independence at the first available date, which turns out to be July of 1946. Now, American acquisition in the Philippines is also going to extend the nation's interests in the Pacific all the way to China. In September 1898, we are going to respond to the growing encroachment of Europeans and other powers in the face of Chinese weakness, and we're going to come up with what we call the open door policy. At this point, key areas of China have been goggled up, officially or unofficially, by various European powers as if they were playing hungry, hungry hippos. And we wanted access to those ports, and each of those European powers was running it for their own interests. So we want the open door, we call it. We want equal access and no special privileges. Now, that is something that we argue and we try to work with, but as long as we, the United States, feel like we're not being overly imposed upon by trade barriers put in place by Europeans, we don't really force the issue to any massive degree. Now, these are also going to result in what they call open door notes to Japan and other European powers, but we have to keep in mind that while the United States is going to advocate this, and while we are going to work towards making sure that we have the access we want, it was really not possible for the United States to force another nation to adhere to this policy. We were just able to use this type of discussion to get greater American access to trade. Now, the Spanish-American War is also going to reveal serious problems with the American military at this point, and what's going to happen is McKinley's going to come in and bring in a lawyer to undertake a number of reforms. We're going to enlarge the Army, we're going to establish standards for National Guard, create officer schools, and we are going to create a body of military advisors to the Secretary of War known as a Joint Chiefs of Staff. So we're really going to overhaul the Army, and that's going to provide benefits in later wars. And we are kind of getting up to the time period where World War I will be on the horizon in just a couple of lectures. So what's the big idea here? Well, American imperialism really begins out of economic interests, and sugar is very much a driving force there. And again, it starts out with small goals. We're looking for naval bases or for islands where we can place a coaling station so we can refuel ships as we engage in trade with other nations. But the Spanish-American War comes along and redefines that. We gain quite a bit of territory as a result of that. Cuba, though, remains a nominally independent country, but the Philippines becomes very controversial, and the question of what do we do now that we've acquired this empire becomes central to our thinking about foreign policy. But more important than that, what this marks is the United States playing a much bigger, much more increased, and much more powerful role on the world stage. See you in the next lecture.